Are unions bad for the economy, and are they good for workers? Could they actually be both of these things at the same time? Interesting question. Let's start with what a union is and the basic structure. So I have this basic kind of working definition. A union is an organization typically made up of individuals elected by workers who represent workers when negotiating for workers' rights, wages, and responsibilities. This process of collective representation and negotiation is also known as collective bargaining. Put even more simply, unions are an entity which pools the bargaining power of workers in order to address the power imbalance often present between capital owners and individual laborers. Naturally, if you're just one person arguing like, hey, I deserve a raise. I want you to provide me a healthcare plan. I want to have 4 weeks of vacation instead of 3. It's easier to negotiate that kind of thing as a pool of workers where we all get those benefits versus each individual worker kind of facing the full power of capital interest by themselves. And so that's what unions are. That's the way that, at least in theory, we would imagine that they would operate. And so I guess we can kind of go one by one. The first section here that I have outlined is why unions theoretically and values based. So like in theory, like from a values perspective, from a theoretical perspective, why would we want unions? So some of the things that I put in here are, like I said, it addresses the power imbalance or imbalances between labor and capital, that capital owners essentially necessarily have more bargaining leverage with employees than workers. There's some instances where in theory their labor rents exist and there's actually a power imbalance between labor and capital that favors labor. Very unusually the case though, and it's not really worth discussing because it's not really a macro phenomena. Another one is like it is a democratic structure in the workplace, insofar as we can make, workplaces more democratic without having terribly deleterious effects on the economy. Seems like something we would want to do. And it also addresses, in my view, principal agent problems within corporations, right? That, same thing with worker board membership. When you have sort of employee representation in companies, it can allow workers to be able to speak a little bit more freely, critique, and be involved in process setting and rule setting within organizations that can avoid basically principal agent problems. And for those that don't know, a principal agent problem is essentially a problem where you have a disconnect between the principal, the originator of a policy, and the agent, the sort of actor of a policy. And this is typically a criticism of centrally planned economies, but frankly, companies can be the same thing. I mean, we've all worked at companies, maybe not, I don't know about Micah because he's such a young boy. I don't know if he's worked at many companies at this point, but, for the most of us, right, we've worked at companies that have, problems where the corporate leadership institutes a policy that doesn't seem to work out too well and not very practical. And, these problems can be alleviated in a world where we have unions or some sort of broader level employee representation. Micah, what would you say? Do you think that there's what are the theoretical benefits of unions? Are there values-based reasons to want unions? What do you think, Micah?
I think that the main reason why you'd want unions is if you think monopsony is widespread, or like basically there's like labor market deficiencies, right? So in like basic economics, a purely neoclassical version of the world, you may think that wages are set at their optimal level and working conditions are set at their optimal level. And that kind of model assumes that there's perfect competition amongst employers. And that workers have perfect information and employers have perfect information, and there's not huge transaction costs. We just know that's not the case. We know that people don't like having to leave the place they work at and find a new job. We know that if you have some sort of specialty, like let's say you're a rocket scientist, there's not a gazillion rocket scientist jobs waiting for you. So it's not like you can easily leave. And because of all these reasons, it can give, in some cases, employers extra bargaining power. It can allow them to set wages at a level that is low. The wages should be set.
First, Micah, internet interruption.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, Micah.
Yeah. So it allows wages to fall to a level that is not what it would be under an ideal market conditions. And so I think that the case for unions could be made if they were able to correct for this deficiency. I think a second maybe theoretical benefit is that in regards to changes to working conditions, it seems like in many cases, workers would be willing to trade off maybe some wages, some compensation for like big improvements in working conditions and treatment, but it's not always clear how they're supposed to do this in an ununionized firm. I assume that the employer is supposed to just know what the right way to treat their employees is and what the ideal trade-off is. That's just simply not the case. And so unions can serve as a mechanism to represent the real views and experiences of employees and thereby create more utility maximizing labor usage models within firms. So I'd say those like, more democratic representation of worker interest, producing more information for employers in their decisions, and second, setting wages at a level that corrects for maybe various market failures.
There we go. And then SDL, from your perspective, is there anything that you can think of in terms of theoretical value of unions? And are there sort of principled reasons why you would be in favor of unions?
Yeah, I think the first obvious one is like if you believe that democracy is generally a good thing in society, then unions are a shift towards a more democratic structure in the workplace. And that's important because workplaces are often structured very undemocratically, right? Like your boss can fire you. They have near dictatorial control. Obviously, you have the ability to go to another boss, but that boss also has near dictatorial control. So
having free speech in corporations,
there literally isn't, right? Like for a decent chunk of everyone's lives, one third of most people's, not one third, one half of everyone's waking life, if you're working, you're going to spend at the mercy of someone who has a lot of power over you, but you have very little way to respond. So there's this argument that like, if you just care about democratic structure throughout society, you should support things like unions because they add democratic power in the workplace. But I would note that this democratic power extends beyond that. And an old lefty argument is that employers can freely associate to form political groups, right? Like it's very easy to form a lobbying group and lobby the government for something, but it's a lot harder to do that for workers because there's a lot more of them. They have a lot less money individually. And so you have to have some institution which can organize and regiment those people to pursue political goals. And something we see in places that have more unions is that they pursue more policies which tend to pay benefits to people who are low income, like pro-disability benefits, a lot more child benefits. There was a study that came out back in, I think, 2014, which showed that places which have more private sector unions have higher income mobility and higher wages for non-union workers. So there's these sort of second order benefits outside the firm, I think, from democratic organization of workers to pursue their own interests.
There we go. So those are our theoretical reasons for sort of, in some inherent sense, supporting unions. And so now we can move towards the more practical sort of application. The actually existing unions of the world, right? What are the effects that we see? From my perspective, like some of the good things that you can get, that you can certainly garner from like the literature on unions and unionization, is that it does lower wage inequality, right, within firms. And this is obviously a good thing if you essentially imagine that lower paid people should be paid probably a bit more than they're paid now, where when we lower wage inequality, we tend to see like wages for the upper end compress and wages for very poor workers go up. And so a lot of times when you look at studies, like union wage premium is like absolutely a thing, that when you work at a company that is represented by a union or a collective bargaining contract, you'll find that, well, wages tend to go up, and that the amount that wages go up is disproportionately shared by basically workers who are in the bottom 50th percentile of earners at a company. And, that's probably at least a decent thing, a decent outcome that I might find in the literature. What Micah said, one thing that I find as well is that certainly it does address monopsony power, that it seems like insofar as, we're able to cleanly study the effects of, in the presence of monopsony power, it seems like firms that have unions or again are covered by collective bargaining contracts, they don't really have to suffer this problem. And, again, like monopsony power is just when you have a monopoly, essentially monopoly power, but for the buyers of a good. And so in the labor market, the buyer of labor is the corporation. right? And the seller of labor is the laborer, right? Whereas in a normal market, like if Apple is a monopoly, well, they're selling a product and they have a monopoly on the selling of a product. And so in this case, you have a monopoly on the buyer side where, companies can basically push wages down artificially. And that seems to be a very fitted way of addressing monopoly power as well. Like one of the things that conservatives will sometimes point out is, well, minimum wages are stupid. All those socialist countries that you love in the Nordics, they don't actually have a minimum wage. And that's why minimum wages are dog shit. There's some truth to that in the sense that like a minimum wage is like the crudest way to address monopsony power. Like, hey, just make it to where you have to pay workers above a certain amount. And so no, monopsony power necessarily goes down. Minimum wages address monopsony power, but with unions, because they're negotiated on a firm or sectoral level, it's a more fitted way of doing that. Because, for instance, like the optimal wage for like an electrician versus the optimal wage for like a fast food worker, it might just be different, right? The monopsony power might affect these two different workers in fundamentally different ways. And so having a union for fast food workers and a union for electricians would be able to fix this problem in probably a more optimal way than just like a harsh minimum wage policy. Micah, from your review of the literature, what can we say about the benefits of unions, strictly speaking?
Yeah, I think it's really heterogeneous depending on the country and the specific union institutions you have, right? And so my understanding is the literature on at least the labor conditions and levels of compensation in countries like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, seems like things are working out pretty fine. You have pretty low unemployment levels. You have pretty high compensation levels compared to peer nations with similar incomes. You have a lot of labor market flexibility. Doesn't seem like product quality is damaged. Seems like research and development is pretty strong. So I'd say that the case for unions really lies in looking at these countries which seem to have gotten the institutions right. And later I'll talk about all the research that has been conducted on the areas and places where unions have been done maybe not as well.
Sure. Yeah. And STL, from your perspective, are there any like broad benefits of unions in the literature? Like, I think that's one thing I'm trying to kind of get at is despite the model of unionization, and we'll talk about those models later, like what are some broad truths that we can garner and say like these are good things that unions can basically achieve all else equal?
Something that I've seen is claims that higher unionization seems to decrease the likelihood of workplace death. Like Micah talked about how there's just some information that isn't transferred through the workplace structure. A boss may not know how to run the workplace best, and having that information and also having a mechanism for workers to be like, "Hey, I don't want to die. Do not make me do this, or I will go on strike." The study that I'm thinking of is Zurab 2018, and they found that right to work laws increased the rate of workplace death by 15%. And the mechanism for that is decreased unionization. So there seems to be some mechanism, like safety is a key one, but you can imagine this for a lot of other things. Like it's possible that in addition to safety, like other considerations, environmental considerations, whatever, sexual harassment, that having a institution which is like owned by the people who actually have to inhabit the workplace may make the workplace less bad at doing that thing.
Right. HR is not the same as a union. Right. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, you can file a complaint with HR, but really the function of HR is literally entirely just to lower the liability of the corporation, not really to get like a better working condition for employees that work there. Right. And so, yeah, again, this kind of goes back to that sort of principal agent problem, right? Where because corporations are structured autocratically, it sort of necessarily leads to problems like this where like workers might see an inefficient process, but they just might be scared to say anything because a lot of times bosses just, don't take criticism very well, right? And that can be quite annoying to deal with from a worker's perspective. But it also can be bad for the productivity of the firm, the mental health of the employees, and just like the comfort level of the employees as well. Like obviously it's not a kind of, that's, I would say like, my basic survey of talking to people who have worked at unionized shops is like, yeah, it's nice that I can kind of just like have an honest conversation with my boss and not worried about getting fired, right? That can be, a nice thing. And I can certainly understand where they're coming from in that regard. So Those are some good, like, basic truths of unions. Like, these are some things that no matter how you structure the unions, they tend to provide these types of benefits. And so now we'll go into the bad of unions. Like, what are some things that, generally speaking, like if you're going to be pro-union, what are some things that you really have to look out for in terms of your exact union proposal? You know, that unions might have these, like, all else equal negative things, and so you might just have to do things to patch those negatives, or to structure unions in a certain way to avoid these downside problems. Micah, we'll start with you. What are some of these bad things that unions might end up causing to happen that we have to address in our proposals?
Yeah, so especially in studies in America, you do see like a lot of these studies reflect that you could see reductions in R&D spending and capital expenditures. You can also see like reductions in certain things that we associate with innovation. So that could be like there's plenty of different patent measures. So it could be like you know the number of patents that a firm creates, and the patents are weighted not just by like the number of patents that you've gotten, but by how many times they're cited for the use in some sort of technology or product. You could also see reductions in product quality. So this is something that's very surprising. There's been some studies that have reflected this to be the case. So that could be measured by something like product recall rate. So like how frequently do we actually have to claw back the product and find that there's some sort of issue with the product that we provided. And there's multiple different methodologies for these studies, but the things I just referenced were regression discontinuity studies. So basically, they looked at like a collection of firms which are like in the same industry, and they looked at only firms that had attempts at unionization. And so they compared two groups. One group was firms that just failed to unionize, like just barely. And then the other group was the collection of firms that just barely ended up unionizing. And so they thought that was a good comparative, two groups to study for these purposes. You can also see reductions in employment. Now, depending on how broad your bargaining is, if you use like sectoral bargaining where you're like the entire industry is being bargained, centrally, you can see very, very big employment reductions. You can also see job lock from increases in benefits. So some unions in some countries have a propensity to bargain for benefits over wages. And since benefits tend to be tied to your current employer, that can lead to basically people having actually less labor mobility, being kind of less likely to leave a firm and go somewhere else, which could have economically harmful effects. Labor flight is another issue. So this is actually produced by one of the things that we'd say is positive about unions. Unions, as you said previously, compress wages. So they reduce wages for higher paid professionals within firms. And so sometimes this can lead to a lot of those people that want higher pay leaving the unionized firms, going to other firms that don't have that same union. Alternatively, it could lead to less people trying to pursue those specific skills and specialties that yield high incomes, because now it pays less. There's less of a premium that you get for developing that skill. The last things I'll mention is some unions bargain anti-automation and anti-technology contracts, where they say, no, you actually have to have two workers doing this job, even though only one is necessary, or no, you can't use this labor savings technology, even though it really is a good technology to use. And finally, you can see unions, just like they can advocate for good policies sometimes when they find it beneficial, they also sometimes advocate for bad policies, like the Jones Act, like protectionist policies, strengthening occupational licensing, making it harder for people to be able to legally enter their profession, to hike their wages, other negative regulations and policies like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I would echo a lot of that, unions are a good thing, sort of all else equal. Like it would be difficult to, based on my survey of the literature, basically, it would be difficult to say that there's a place where unions are just like bad for that. Like it would be better if they just didn't have unions like that. I feel like even in the worst sort of organized system of unions, you could say Spain or Italy or even America, arguably, it's very difficult to say like, oh yeah, unions are like just bad and just get rid of all unions and we'd end up with better outcomes. But certainly it's to say that there are bad things that unions can do. And unions are a distinct sort of political entity, like Micah's describing as well. Like sometimes unions will advocate for things that are bad socially speaking, because, a lot of times left-leaning figures will assume that the interest of workers just like perfectly aligns with the interests of broader society. But that's not really true, right? That, the interest of the consumers of that corporation, the interest of the society that corporation exists in, the interests of the workers and the interests of capital all exist whenever we're talking about sort of a policy that affects any one of these interest groups. And like the spillover effects can affect any one of these interest groups as well, right? So certainly there's a lot of examples of unions that advocate for, a classic example, unions advocate against green energy sometimes, right? Unions will say, we don't want to have green energy because we're a coal union, and we don't want all our fucking workers to be fired because, we represent coal workers, right? And so there probably needs to be, and we'll get into it later, but like a broader buy-in to worker interests probably can solve a lot of these problems. And even like a more expansive welfare state can solve a lot of these problems, where at least like on the margin, we can depress those types of motivations to some degree. And I would agree with pretty much everything. Like everything that Micah said is like theoretically and practically, there are some examples of unions doing things that lead to those outcomes. STL, do you have anything to add in that regard, the bad of unions?
No, I think those two categories that mentally I most think about are unions and their effect on labor market rigidity, like Micah was talking about. So the big effects there are, imposing barriers to entry. Sometimes, we don't, like in the American Medical Association is kind of a combination union and like small business owner association. Depending on the type of doctor, but they want to impose rigid entry to the market so they can increase doctors' wages. There was recently a strike in South Korea by doctors who want to impose, I don't actually know whether they're unionized, but whether they are or not, organized labor there is trying to impose a barrier so they can decrease entry to the market and raise the cost of that type of labor, which is probably bad. Like it's probably bad to make a segmented part of the market where labor costs just go up for no socially beneficial reason. And the second one is probably labor-saving technology, like Micah was talking about. That because unions have an interest in preserving work, and especially because unions in countries like the United States and Canada are organized at a firm level, they have a very strong interest in making sure that no jobs are lost at their firm, even if adopting a labor-saving technology in this firm might create more jobs for the economy as a whole. So I think this will get into the policy. This will get a little bit into the policy design section, but I do think there's benefits to trying to have union designs which encourage them to think about the economy as a whole or a sector as a whole, rather than just one workplace or one very specific task. Because otherwise, you can try and save labor from being fired at all when it should be labor saved. Like the goal should be automation of everything. Ideally, you just want people to get the benefits from that.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I think that what we're all going to agree on is that clearly there's something that needs to be done in the labor market. Like you can't have a laissez-faire labor market because just plenty of bad things happen. I guess I do want to talk very briefly about some other things I wrote down here and some of the right to work state comparison studies, because I think they're instructive. Now, we do see that some studies have reflected that unions reduce the use of performance-based pay. I find this relatively intuitive. I've never seen a union that's in favor of performance-based pay. I have seen unions that are against it. And so sometimes when you see negative productivity effects of unions, people attribute that negative productivity effect maybe to the fact that they might actually oppose what we might consider pro-productivity compensation schemes. I don't know if you'll have any thoughts regarding that.
I definitely think that's part of it. Some union contracts as well can make it like very hard to fire or fire like the least productive employees. So well-structured union contracts can reduce that. And that might be one of the benefits of having very large union contracts, because you can try to design all of them to follow like a standard, fairly good setup. I would maybe offer two notes in contrast to Micah's points, just that on the union productivity measure, I know there's two studies from a guy named Sojourner that I have. which suggests that in, I think, nursing homes and charter schools, using the same regression discontinuity design, there was no impact on productivity of places which just barely unionized versus just barely didn't. So the students didn't get any dumber or any smarter, and the nursing homes didn't get any old people killing or less old people killing. So I guess I would just note, like, I'm going to bet there's going to be large heterogeneous effects there, and my assumption is some places unionization would raise productivity, and some places it would lower it.
I think to the extent that you would see a total productivity reduction from unions, it wouldn't be because now, like, I'm not sure they changed compensation schemes so much so that it would actually be a huge deal, because most places don't use productivity-based pay. I imagine it would be because unions might limit employment at certain firms, right? You're raising the wage rate or the total compensation rate for an employee. So maybe some higher productivity firms may be less likely, may hire less people. And so you could see aggregate productivity impacts.
Well, that's what I wanted to get at was something I've long wondered is whether the impact of production reduction of unions in the United States is driven particularly by how we do unions in this country, because they are firm level unions, as in the vast majority of people in this country, if you're in one firm and there's one union there, then they negotiate the one contract for that firm. That contract doesn't go for any other firms. Yeah. But if there was a contract for the entire sector, that means that your firm unionizing doesn't really screw you over and help your competitors, which might have productivity lowering effects because investors will just go to your competitors now. Instead, if it's screwing everyone equally or benefiting everyone equally, then it may not have like a shift in productivity away. I did want to note, maybe the last argument would be, this is the argument I would give. There is probably a second order productivity raising effect of unions just because they tend to promote policies like education and child benefits, which will raise people's well-being and the productivity of like the population as a whole in the long run, which you won't observe at a union at a specific firm level. Like you might imagine that if you go from 10% unionization to 20%, education funding might go up by about 1%. There's some studies related to that and youth vote and whatnot. But point is that might have a productivity effect, even if each individual firm that unionized became less productive as a whole. So
go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, I think I'd also like have to really scrutinize how these individual studies define productivity, right? Because like naturally, when we think of productivity, we think of like sort of per worker unit output of, you know, service or product that the company is producing. But it could also be the case that that's just like the utilitarian thing to do, right? Because I could imagine a scenario where like an Amazon factory unionizes, and because they unionize, the Amazon factory says, you know, hey, we're gonna have 8-hour days, and we're gonna have bathroom breaks, and we're gonna have lunch breaks, and we're gonna have vacation days, and we're gonna have sick days, and like all of these things probably lower the aggregate output of that warehouse. But it's in exchange for like not a completely miserable fucking working environment.
Right? It really just depends on how you measure it, right?
Exactly.
That's totally fair. And I'd also like to note, because we're being so nuanced, you know, I imagine some of this R&D spending and CapEx spending reductions could go away in a system in which maybe there's that those wage hikes are kind of happening everywhere. I mean, part of it is you're actually just eating up, you know, some of what capital's income is, and capital is going to reinvest a percentage of its income. But part of it's also that, like, okay, if you have a unionized firm, as far as investors are concerned, many times your firm has a disease. It's sick. I'm less likely to invest in a firm that has that disease. Now, I do want to mention these right to work studies because I have the list of them here. You mentioned earlier, Econoboy, that it seems clear to you that states, like, it's better to have more unions than not, pretty much under any institutions. I'm not going to say I necessarily disagree with that.
No, that's not. So what I mean by when I say that, it's hard to imagine a scenario where like taking the unions, just like completely taking the unions away is just like a net good. What I mean by that is that I would imagine that in all societies with unions probably have a net benefit. Like it would probably be difficult to present a case where like, oh no, unions are like, maybe there's some quibbling with public sector unions, like it could be the case, but it seems to be the case where unions are probably net beneficial, but they could have greatly negative effects along with greatly positive effects that net out to good effects. But the downside of unions can still needs to be addressed in a lot of these models that we're going to talk about later. So,
yeah, I mean, what from my understanding, I have a list of studies in the document that I linked. There's a lot of comparisons between like right to work states and non-right to work states. And what they try to do is they try to like make it comparable. So they look at like states.
Oh no, he's gone, boys. Big union. They got him.
Base the AFL-CIO hunting Micah at this very minute.
We'll never know. We can hear you now, Micah.
I'd also like to say really quickly before I start studying, like going about these studies, there is nobody who works harder on campaigns specifically for Democrats than union workers. AFL-CIO, Hope, AFSCME, 123 local. Like these union workers are some of the sweetest people in the world. But just let's talk about these studies for a second. The right to work studies basically try to look at comparable states, and they look at like they're basically fully comparable before the right to work laws go into effect, and the right to work laws go into effect, and they try to see, okay, well, how are these states different?
Really
now?
Quick, can you define right to work for the audience?
Oh yeah, sure. So right to work is basically a law that allows union workers in unionized firms to opt out of paying union dues. And so if you don't want to pay union dues, you don't have to. And what that really leads to, at least you would expect, is less unions because a lot of workers end up opting out. And that means unions have less dues and like less money, and they don't do as well. Sometimes they go away, right? Because too many people opted out. And so what it seems to be the case in these states is they have higher employment rates, higher investment rates, higher R&D spending, and there's either some negative impact on wages or no impact on wages. I imagine it is somewhat negative. And so like it shows that there's potentially some sort of trade-off here between R&D spending and employment and the wage level in the state whenever you pass these right to work laws. Do you guys have any interesting commentary on that?
No, I mean, I agree that I have no quibbles with the downsides of unions, right? That unions, I mean, we could say the same thing, like, oh, hey, because we have capitalist ownership, we probably have more pollution, right? Because, investment drives into things that are profitable. Sometimes the profitable investment pollutes a river. Sometimes it cuts down a forest. Sometimes it redevelops like a community center. Like there's going to be like, but that doesn't mean you have to necessarily be anti-capitalist, SDL, okay? God, no, I'm just kidding. But like,
yeah, no, that's fair.
It's just totally like, obviously it's the case that the way that we set up our economic institutions can have negatives and positives. For instance, like the Brunig-Brook debate that happened yesterday on the Three Wonks channel, like one thing that Matt Brunig talks about, I think this is a reasonably nuanced view. He actually kind of concedes. He says that, like welfare systems might have some negative effects. But we can also imagine for as many theoretically negative effects of a welfare system that a libertarian can come up with, like, oh, it might make some people lazy. It might make some people exit the labor force, right? Things like this. You can always just say, well, yeah, but it might make some people take more risks. And it might make some people innovate more because they don't have to necessarily shield the full burden of like going bankrupt or being totally financially destitute and homeless, right? And similarly with unions, like, of course, right, there are probably sort of behavioral effects of unions that are negative, right? And so it's all going to be about like holistically, how do we take the positive of unions and mitigate the negatives as well? And to be fair, like one thing that again right wingers will point out is, well, every Nordic country is right to work. In Nordic countries, you don't have to pay union dues, right? Now, there's obviously nuances there that they don't mention, but there's ways to. I mean, technically, there's ways to do right to work that are net pro-union, right? And you just have to think about those things as well. Any final comments on the bad of unions, STL, before we move on to our ideal structure of unions?
No, I'd be happy to take the bargain of sectoral bargaining for right to work laws. I think that if we simply established a union contract for every person in this country, but people didn't have to pay union dues, I would probably accept that bargain.
Right. All right. Well, yeah, go on.
The only comment I have is I have not read these right to work studies, so I can't comment on it. I'm trusting Micah to report them correctly and everything. And so
never trust a neoliberal. Come on.
That's true.
Have you learned nothing?
Western propaganda coming out of the mouth of this pig dog, Micah. The big question I always have with these right to work studies is whether it's a macro level consequence of the same thing we talked about with like capital expenditure on firm level studies, that maybe if you reduce the unionization rate, more investors will invest in a given area because wages are cheaper in that area now. And so profits are higher and like there's a natural incentive to invest. But whether that would not hold true were union contracts indeed to be national, for example. Mike cut out.
It's fine. We don't need him anyway.
Yeah. Are you asking me whether I think that's the case?
Oh, that's sort of the question, right? Is it driven by investor confidence essentially increasing in right to work states?
Yeah, I really imagine it's just a combination. I think that probably explains part of it. I also do imagine that, there is really a negative employment impact of unions, especially because in America, I mean, we're not really trying to combat the labor market rigidity imposed by unions at all. We probably have some of the most rigid union contracts, period.
Especially for health insurance, right?
Exactly. And that's job lock, right? And so that's just the theme that we're going to hit at a lot. It's like, I think that the cost of unions in the American institutional context is just way higher than it needs to be. It doesn't need to have necessarily as many cons. Like, I had a very long list of cons. You can fix a lot of those with different institutions.
Yeah, if maybe this would be a good episode, like just what are like the 3 things you would change about the American economy? Because honestly, we might all agree on the 3 things. Like if we had a universal healthcare system that wasn't employee based, if we had like a relatively Georgian housing market, and if we had a much more generous welfare system, if we could do like those 3 things, I think you would. So many other policies become much easier to implement at that point, right? Because like we're talking about like, labor market rigidities with healthcare, like it kind of makes unions a little fucky, and the lack of a welfare state means unions have to go like super hard in on the shit they negotiate for because, what else are you going to do? And obviously not having housing and being able to develop things just makes every economic policy significantly harder. We're going to talk about that in the green energy section. So caveats aside, we're going to have a section where we talk about America specifically. What would we do to help unionization in America? But then we'll move to our ideal system before that. STL, what were you going to say?
I was just going to comment that I know a stat that Matt Brunig likes to raise is that every 6 years, every American loses their healthcare, just based on the assumption that if you get your healthcare through your employer and the average American switches employers at least every 6 years, then for something like 80% of Americans, you lose your healthcare every 6 years. So that's a real rigidity to it. People might switch jobs more often or might have different job searches if they knew that they would get a roughly similar level of healthcare no matter where they went. So
I mean, how often? I've had this happen to me where it's like, I've got about a month or 2 between jobs. Let's just hope. Let's hope nothing happens.
And that's just not a good way to design society.
And I mean, if you're a diabetic like me, you have a chronic condition, going a month or 2 without your insulin is simply just not even an option.
Right, it's going to be out of pocket.
There's a real economic cost to that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, not to get sidetracked on a healthcare discussion, it's just to say that
diabetes.
Yeah, it's just to say that all these things, like your ideology in general should be holistic, right? And so like all these policies affect the other ones, right? Not having a universal healthcare system ends up kind of causing your unions to be a little bit less efficient than they otherwise would be, and it can skew the study results, as Mike and STL alluded to. But all right, well, I think it's more interesting to talk about our ideal system before we talk about the American system. And so I guess I'll go first on this. So, this next section, how would we each sort of ideally structure unions if, we didn't have to necessarily worry about the intricacies of, the American system. So, and this will be more of a broad overview than when we get into the American system where we're talking about like very specific policies. So number one, I think the best way to organize unions from my perspective, number one is sectoral bargaining. So STL's alluded to it earlier. There's sort of a few different ways that you can structure unions in terms of who they bargain for and like the scope of their bargaining. You could have establishment level unions, right? Where like this is a union for this specific company and the contract that they negotiate for only covers employees at that specific company. You could have trade-based unions. You could have a union that just like, hey, we're the union that represents electricians. and we just negotiate on behalf of electricians, and that's how we do it. We have this sort of industry-wide standard that we set, which that's a little bit more popular, I think, in the UK, but that's not a super popular thing anymore, I don't believe. And then there's industry sort of level unions, right? Sectoral / industry level unions where, this is the energy industry, right? This is the airline industry, this is the fast food industry, where the unions that exist in the firms within those industries sort of pool their collective power. So you've got the unions at each firm, and then those unions pool their power to negotiate with like an employers association, where the employers association comes in and says, we're representing the employers, the unions represent the workers across the industry, and then they negotiate basically on behalf of a large majority, a large chunk, disproportionate chunk of the workers within that industry, if not the entire industry. And then there's this, in theory, there could be, I call it worker union, where it's just the union for workers, the whole shebang, the whole country. It's just the whole entire country covered under one union. And again, this is not really, there's really nowhere that has this, but it's theoretically possible, and some people advocate for it. The reason that I would say sectoral bargaining is like the best ground is because you want your bargaining system. Yeah, go on, STL.
I did just want to mention there was one country that had one big union for all the workers. It was called Nazi Germany.
True. Yeah, you could, in theory, you could do it.
Socked them like for Econoboy to support Nazi Germany.
Yes, fascist Econoboy says Hitler was right. We should have one big union.
I said national worker union bad. I said sectoral bargaining better.
Damn, anti-Hitler, anti-fascist Econoboy.
I actually am very concerned about sectoral bargaining.
Sorry, Econoboy should finish his spiel. I was trying to interrupt with a dumb joke.
Yeah, and I was going to say, here's the reason I say sectoral bargaining is probably the best system. In general, I would say that number one, you need to have some amount of decentralization with bargaining. Like full national level bargaining is probably not good because you don't necessarily want one contract to represent all the workers. Now, the caveat to that is that in theory, you could have a national level bargaining like deal that you pull, but you would have to somehow ensure that there's a sufficient understanding between both sides of that negotiation that this would be like a minimum standard, like a very minimal standard. Like, hey, every worker in the country is going to make $11 an hour and have a week of it would have to be very minimal. The issue that when you get into like these big, these large coverage union collective contracts is that sometimes that can lead to rigidity, right? That, if you have one contract that like goes all the way, 4 weeks of vacation, $28 an hour minimum wage, here's the exact healthcare plan, here's the exact worker regulations, here's how you're going to handle hiring and firing. That's just not appropriate for literally every single worker, right? And so there needs to be some decentralization, some sort of bargaining in that regard. And it tends to be the case, it seems like in the literature that I have read, that sectoral coordination is better than individual level, establishment level corporation union bargaining, and part of the reason for that is that the sectoral contracts tend to be a little bit more conservative than the company level contract, right? And that's good again because if you've got a union on the firm level, sometimes because that union doesn't have as holistic a view of the industry, and because they're not working with a broad selection of employers from an employer association, they're just working with their one employer, that can lead to contracts that are particularly bad for like the productivity of the company, the productivity of the industry in general. And that can multiply in a world where you have like unorganized, decentralized negotiation, because that contract might cover a sector-wide agreement that ends up being very rigid. So sectoral bargaining, it does depend on how you manage it, but I think sectoral bargaining is probably better than just individual level bargaining. I also have some bullet points here. Like number one, it should be like, I say, quote, ridiculously easy to start a union. And we can talk about this more in the next section, but basically like, it just shouldn't be very hard to start a union. It should be as simple as like, if a majority of workers want to start a union and start a collective bargaining process, that's just all it should take. Now, in principle, that's how every country works. Oh, a majority of workers say they want it, just go ahead and do it then, right? But obviously in practice, and we'll get into that more later, that is not really quite how it works. And capital and state interests can really quash the ability to start unions, which is pretty ridiculous. And then the next part I would say is that there should be some sort of mandatory, like, state regulation on the participation of negotiations, right? That, if workers decide to unionize, that the employer should have some obligation to actually good faith participate in those negotiations, and go from there. Like, we have problems in this country where, employers will basically just stall out negotiations forever and just for a long time. And because the union is not technically established, there's not as much of an ability to go on strike and actually manage that process. And so just having some requirement to actually proactively involve yourself in regulations is probably important. And then the fourth thing that I would say, overarching and how I would design these institutions, is that whatever your labor regulation institutions are, they need to be really well funded. That when workers say, I want a union, there needs to be a very well funded process for counting those votes, for establishing that those votes need to happen, for managing the organization of that process. A lot of countries have tripartite, quote unquote, negotiation systems where essentially the state will sort of mediate and manage those negotiations to some extent, and act as like a tiebreaker if there's just an irresolvable sort of dispute between these two groups. And that's good because, again, we don't want to have these situations that we have in America where you vote to unionize and then it takes 12 years to get a contract. That's inefficient. It's unreasonable. It's obviously unfair to workers. And it's, it favors basically, the capital interest much more than the labor interest. And the whole point of this is to try and balance that out to where it's a truly fair sort of negotiating process. And I think we'll talk about later on, there's some supporting systems that you could argue for that would support the system as all. I call it, in the American section, the grab bag of labor and capital management changes. So one thing is incentivize employee stock ownership, right? If you did this, again, you can better align the interests of labor and capital because labor becomes capital at that point, right? And you don't necessarily have as many problems where unions might not necessarily be empathetic to capital owners. But if you had robust employee stock ownership, if you had worker board membership, one of the things I find in the literature is that trust between labor and capital is really important for determining the actual social outcomes of collective bargaining processes. That if you have low trust between labor and capital, you end up with very bad and skewed collective bargaining contracts. And so having worker board membership and employee or union stock ownership can help sort of institute that. You can also talk about, broader things like a sovereign wealth fund where collective capital ownership is probably going to be a bit more sympathetic to unions, and there would probably be more trust in that relationship between just private capital ownership. So that could help that problem to some, arguable degree. Things like that I think are probably decently important. That's my ideal system. And we talked before about, having a welfare state, having that supports workers and striking workers specifically, universal health care, affordable housing. These are all things that allow workers to be a little bit more able to pull the trigger on a strike because obviously, one thing in democratization that you'll learn is that if the opposition does not have a credible threat of actually taking power from the ruling government, well, it's not really a democracy, right? And similarly with unions, if the union basically has no actual ability to run a strike, prevent people from crossing the picket line, well, do you really have a union at that point? Probably not, right? So you need these sort of institutions that would be able to assist in the ability of workers to actually have a credible threat of going on strike and hurting the corporate profits in order to get what they want. So that's my ideal overview. SDL, how about you go next? How would you ideally structure unions in our world that we live in today?
You talked about a lot of the institutions that are important. Some is sectoral bargaining. I'd like to see the contracts be broadly as wide as possible. I really like the wage board approach in the United States because the wage law that we have, I'm totally blanking on the name of it. It's the 1947 Labor Act. I think Taft-Hartley, maybe. it basically bans a lot of things which are commonplace in other countries, like solidarity strikes, meaning that let's say that you want to unionize in, this McDonald's. Well, all the other fast foods around town can strike, for example, and you can strike at the same time because they want to agree with you. Solidarity strikes like that are banned in U.S. law. You can't do that.
I love how, to add to that, I love how petty it can be as well. Like what's currently going on in Sweden with Elon Musk and Tesla, where like the unions just coordinate specifically to fuck over Tesla. And again, it's not about like billionaires bad, fucking over Elon is funny, but it's just a labor culture that's implemented there that is good. Like what they'll do in Sweden, for instance, is Elon Musk says, yeah, we're not going to unionize our car, our car depots or whatever in Sweden. We're just not going to do it. And so what'll happen is all of Sweden's unions will just coordinate to specifically fuck Tesla over to where they have to unionize their shops. So for instance, like the postal service just won't deliver any mail. Oh, that's a parcel for Tesla. Fuck that. Just leave it in the back. We're not taking it. Oh, that's a shipment on a boat for Tesla cars. We're not unloading it. Put it back in sea. We're not going to do it. And just like every part of the supply chain is like, yep, we don't deal with Tesla anymore. They don't want to unionize. Fuck them. We're not going to deal with it. So that's not necessarily a strike, but that's an example of like that, the power to coordinate and dictate the conditions of your work such that it benefits workers that aren't even necessarily even in your same industry. Like a postal worker versus a guy working at a Tesla warehouse. Like these are in theory totally different workers, but you can create a culture that is sort of cross-supportive, which is ultimately good for maintaining union power and labor power in a country.
Back in the more openly socialist era, so the Sweden often called wage bargaining like solidarity wages, that part of the goal of having relatively equal wages across society and a sort of common worker culture was to create that sort of solidarity, that we're all in one cause, and if someone wants to screw us over, then we will screw them over. So I guess I think sectoral bargaining is a big one. I know that one of so in the United States, the way you have to do that is largely through tripartite wage boards. Unless you can pass a change to the Taft-Hartley 1947 Act, you're just not going to get like sectoral bargaining. You're just not going to get any types of these broader labor institutions. So the big way you can do so is through some kind of tripartite wage board. Back in the 40s, basically during World War II, basically all the states created this board, which nominally had three parties. That's why it's tripartite. One was labor, one was the firms, the producers, and one was the general public, usually the state government. And theoretically, the goal of that is to try and mediate the interest of all three. So you can even think of it as the state isn't just trying to mediate as the tiebreaker. Sometimes the role is attempting to have the role of the consumer interested, because sometimes the producer doesn't have the consumer's best interest in heart, and sometimes a union doesn't have the consumer's best interest in heart. We talked about how doctors' unions often do not have consumers' best interest in heart. They want more money, and since the vast majority of medical compensation is not going, it's going to those workers, that means that you are paying more for medical care. So I don't know. I'm a big fan of having some kind of tripartite wage board. I do think there's some role of trying to represent the general society, because either labor or producer can screw over general society. And I guess my last quirk, and I haven't found any interesting policy suggestions for this, but I would love to see some way to use tripartite wage boards to subsidize unions and even subsidize employers for labor-saving technologies. We talked a little bit before about how labor rigidity and labor-saving technology being opposed can be results of having more unions. And I would love to just genuinely have like a subsidy for this, that, hey, you're going to take job losses, you get more money.
Well, but also having like
subsidizing firing people based.
Wow. No, I was going to say like also just having like part of that is if you don't necessarily like part of that is you can align the interests of labor and capital just by encouraging things like ESOPs, right? That like, hey, we have this labor-saving technology. It's, if there's like this pool of stock owned by the union or owned by employees in a horizontal sense, like, hey, this labor-saving technology, you're not going to be fired from it. We're just going to hire less, and you get more returns to capital because you're a capital owner as well. That can all go back into that same, hopefully, that incentive bundle, because all those negatives, we recognize all those negatives exist, but again, these types of structures we're arguing for should ideally minimize those negatives to some extent, right? So,
And I know it's spoke for a while. I just want to add, like, as a socialist, I do think there is a long-term goal here that probably extends beyond what Econoboy and definitely what Micah would appreciate. Like, I see part of the goal in a class abolitionist society where you less and less so have an owning class, right, where wealth is more and more equally distributed, that the producers in a tripartite wage board would largely also be the workers. That, like, it's a negotiation between general society and a union and a series of, like, worker-run little cooperatives, a series of democratically run little institutions largely. And so it's like worker versus general public, which is also mostly workers. So the ideal solution is three-way internal class conflict in the long run. Sorry.
Is Micah frozen again?
Yeah,
oh
Micah,
God,
that shocked Micah. Oh my God. Abolishing the capital class has him speechless.
Yeah, I know. So, okay, now it's my ideal union institutional structure. So, y'all mentioned previously sectoral bargaining.
Micah, my God, man.
We did mention sectoral bargaining. That's a good point, Micah. I think we can all agree. You're back.
Wait, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Like, we have good internet in Houston. How's your internet so bad? Like, we live in the same like rough location.
Okay, half of every episode just y'all complain about my internet at this point. I don't know what to do for you. Okay, I don't know what you want. Anyway, we literally have very good internet. Actually, like I took like 2 weeks of my life.
He says
trying to get the best. We use fiber optic cables too. I don't understand what the problem is.
We got good internet. Yes, I freeze about twice an episode, but it's whatever.
It's just more than twice an episode at this point. Now,
the best internet.
Sectoral bargaining is not unambiguously good. Why is it not unambiguously good? Because some of the countries that we really do see have high unemployment rates, and we really do see that those high unemployment rates are related to their union model, are countries that have sectoral bargaining. And so that's countries like France and Italy and Spain, where you have like a very high unemployment rate very consistently over time. And it seems to be the case that it's because they have sectoral bargaining, but with low union density. So like 8% of people are in unions, and those 8% of people are ultimately the ones who elect the union representatives, which end up negotiating the contracts for everybody. And so many times those contracts are negotiated to benefit that 8%. It's great for the 8%, but it's not negotiated in such a way to help the 100%. It actually hurts many people because the wage rates and the contracts are negotiated in such a way so as to produce high levels of unemployment. So I think a tripartite system, as SDL talked about, may make more sense if there's some sort of way we can make sure the union representatives are maybe not just representing current unions, but maybe are able to more accurately represent the entire workforce within an industry, and whether we could have hopefully very impartial technocratic state economists in the mix to really determine how much monopsony is here. You know, how many failures we need to be correcting for. Now, something I would note though is that I did mention previously that monopsony is an issue, and there's labor market failures that can lead to wages being lower than they would be in equilibrium conditions. It's also important to notice that there's frictions that actually hurt employers that lead to wages being higher. Right, so employers don't have perfect information, and that can harm them. Right, employers, there's conditions that employers can be in where they're maybe paying people, more than they should be, and so that's going to offset maybe a degree of the frictions on the other side. So actually, when you count all the frictions, they kind of partially cancel each other out. Now, in terms of other institutional reforms, I would like to see us embrace more of a flex security style model as used in Denmark. Denmark really makes a point of the fact that their labor market, while having very high degrees of unionization, over 65%, if I remember correctly, it's very easy to fire people and it's very easy to hire people. And that's the way that they structure their union contracts makes it such that it's really this whole labor mobility issue that unions generally introduce just isn't there, because the unions are not bargaining for job security. They're not bargaining saying, hey, you can't fire this person, or hey, you can't implement this technology. The unions are bargaining for better working conditions and higher compensation. Totally fair thing.
What's the actual, is it just like literally legally unions just cannot negotiate on job security, or like what's the actual, how do you actually structure
I've read
that?
a lot about this. And it's very hard for me to determine whether it is just an agreement that the unions and the employers have just struck, like this is how things are going to work, and we're gonna order all this social insurance around it so that it makes sense. So you really don't have an incentive to bargain for these kind of things anymore, or whether this is just the law. But in America, unless we can just assume we're going to get all of these surrounding institutions, subsidized job training and a beautiful welfare state, I think I would totally be in favor of just banning them from being on a bargain for these kind of things. Just like ban unions from saying that you can't fire people as part of the contract.
Yeah,
you can't fire this person for this many years, right?
As a part of my research into this, like I really tried to dive deep into this question of like, hey, like what the fuck's going on with some of these countries with like super high levels of unemployment? Let me turn the chat off real quick. And this was just some data that I compiled. This is just wiki data, but I think it comes from the World Bank, so I pretty much trusted it and just pasted it in. And what Mike is describing, if you look at here, is this coverage gap, right? Is this idea where sometimes you have countries like France with very low union density, but very high coverage. And what this means functionally is that there's not a lot of people who are like part of a union in France, but there's like a really overwhelming majority of people that are covered by union negotiated contracts, right? And so France is obviously by far the craziest example of this, with where they have 11 times as many people covered by union contracts as they have actually as a part of unions. And the disconnect that Mike is describing is that, well, this 8% of people that are negotiating the contract for 98% of Frenchmen are probably by character different and have different needs than the 98%. So the contract they're negotiating might be such that it causes rigidity in other markets because it's necessarily not representative. It's not like a fitted contract. And the big question for me when I was looking into this was like, look at Spain, right? So Spain here, you've got a big coverage gap, but then look at like Australia and the Netherlands. Similar coverage gaps, but like a quarter of the unemployment. Like what's happening here? So clearly it seems like you can have a large coverage gap, but have low unemployment. And part of the reason is that Spain has like a particularly just terrible set of labor institutions in general, right? One of the things that Micah described, and this is why I butted in here, was, let me put this data on the screen. This is data from, I believe it was from the OECD as well, but it was compiled. It was basically data on the cost of hiring and firing. And I have this sample of countries here, and you can't really see it because of our windows here. Let me turn them off. You see the sample of countries here: Finland, France, Greece, Iceland, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Sweden, and there's like a couple US partners here. And you can start to see some of the differences here. So number one, the US, obviously pretty bad in terms of all these categories. So like maximum working hours and things like this. And what you'll find is that Spain, in a lot of regards, doesn't have like a particularly high cost of hiring and firing. Like, hey, what's up? Like, like when you look at, the length of fixed contracts, this and that, like it doesn't seem like it's particularly unusual compared to other European counterparts. But when you get over to this is where you see the big difference. And what this is redundancy costs, right? So Spain, particularly by national decree, by like national regulation, forces corporations to pay a lot of severance to their employees who are fired, right? Who are laid off, basically. And it's actually substantially more generous than any of their other counterparts. And what you look at here, you think like, oh, what are the high unemployment countries in Europe, right? You think of Spain, Greece, and you think of France, right? Well, I mean, would you look at that? Like, these are the countries that have particularly generous severance policies mandated. And so the reason why having a severance policy that's generous can lead to high unemployment is because if it's really expensive to fire employees, that means that you're probably not going to fire employees as often, even if they're bad at their job, even if they're not productive, which means there's less openings for new employees to enter the labor market. And so this is unironically, like, I think a big explanation for why this is. And the second thing that actually does have to do with unions in Spain is the fact that unions in Spain, there's a regulation, well, a regulatory state called extension. So one of the ways that you have these coverage gaps is that there's extension laws where employees that aren't part of unions can be covered by a union contract. Well, you have to have some sort of way for that to happen. How are you not part of a union, but you get the union contract? Well, you have to have extension laws. And Spain has like a very like automatic extension, right? So it's like basically, hey, if there's a union contract in your industry, boom, automatic, you're covered by it. And so necessarily, like, that's going to be pretty rigid, whereas a lot of countries like the Netherlands, like even France, which have substantially lower unemployment than Spain, the way that you as a non-union worker get covered by a collective contract is a harder and lengthier process. Not like crazy, but you have to prove basically that you're a representative worker, that like the character of you and your employment is sufficiently similar to the people who are negotiating the contract as a part of a union, such that we don't have these labor market rigidities. And also part of it could be a requirement on the employer association, right? So the employer association in these sectoral agreements is made up of companies in the industry. And so sometimes the requirement is like the employer association has to represent like so much of a percentage of employment in the industry to ensure that the group of people at the negotiating table that are covering so many more people in the industry than are actually at the table in the form of being actually represented by a union are actually inadvertently represented in that process, either through the employer or the union association, right? Because like Micah said, these coverage gaps can be a big problem. They're not necessarily a big problem, but they absolutely can be if you basically like overextend these contracts without sufficient sort of concern for how like representative the contract is holistically. All right, big jump in, Micah, there, but go on.
Okay, so yeah, fair points. Don't really disagree with anything you said there. But yeah, to start, I would just make it illegal for unions to bargain for very bad things. I think there's probably ways to do that. And I think that would make it way easier for a lot of people on my side of politics to be in favor of that. And yeah, it's bad whenever they bargain for bad things. Also, like, we want to nuke lobbying in general. So that could help a lot with public sector unions. You know, public sector unions have a pretty bad track record of lobbying just for like really bad things. Like, you know, whenever you think about a lot of efficiency improvement, policies that improve efficiency, there's basically only one group that consistently finds themselves probably against it. And that's the public employees, which kind of have to exist because of inefficiencies, right? You want to automate a government service like Estonia has. They've automated like 99% of their services, all available online. Who's the only group that's really going to be against that? Probably the employees that actually, you know, their job is doing all this paperwork, right? And so, you know, you could pass like specific limitations on public sector lobbying. I mean, that seems a little bit unnecessarily vindictive. I don't really like targeting any one specific kind of worker and telling them, no, you have less rights than other people. But in general, we think lobbying should have less of an impact. And so that can help with that. A universal welfare state, specifically expanding unemployment insurance, can help a lot with your labor markets as well. So I think also tight labor markets are extremely important, and they get you a lot of the benefits of unions without really any of the negative consequences. And so how do you have consistently tight labor markets? Well, you get a central bank, which is better at doing its job.
Keynesianism on steroids, boys. Let's make it happen.
Well, so, you know, we currently use an inflation target. A lot of people want to do NGDP targeting. I'm a big fan of that. I'm not going to get super into the details about how that works, but we would expect much higher employment levels consistently over time if we use an NGDP target, which means that workers will have more power. And you know, workers will be being treated better because ultimately they're going to have a lot more options. I also believe in pay transparency. So requiring that basically compensation for positions be transparently listed, and people be aware how much people are being paid for positions. It doesn't need to be like the specific person, like this is how much Mike is paid, but like it could be the case that people with this job title get paid this much, and that is published information. There is pay transparency laws that exist around the world, and what do you find? What it helps employers and employees make sure that, you know, the compensation that they're striking is fair. Also, restricting non-compete agreements. Non-compete agreements specifically for lower income workers exist for only one reason, and that is to give employers more power over their employees, to take away their legal option to go to another firm that's competing with that firm. And ultimately, they wreak havoc on your economy. They're pretty bad across the board. They hurt workers, help employers, and they cause deadweight loss. And so if we can help workers and make the economy better, that seems like that's definitely something we should do. Now, if we really are going to try to use unions as an institution to further, the cause of helping workers, which, as I've probably highlighted, I'm a little bit apprehensive about that in the American context. But if we are, I agree with SDL that wage boards are the way to do it, and I'm sure that.
There we go.
Damn. Big monopartite. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's some structures of wage boards that you could use that could mitigate a lot of their harms. But I would note that I would not be unambiguously in favor of a proposal for wage boards, because we have seen that in countries like Australia, where wage boards are a big labor market institution, you will see campaigns literally run on the basis that they're going to go appoint somebody to the wage board, which is going to hike wages for this specific industry, such and such much. That is a completely unacceptable politicization of the labor market, when in reality, these kind of decisions should not be made by politicians. They should be made by employers, workers, and probably economists.
Well, yeah, sure. I guess at the end of the day, like when you're like tripartite negotiations involve the state, right? So I think that in my view, the success the success of your tripartite system is almost necessarily going to relate to the functioning of your democratic institutions, right? That if you like, for instance, in our last episode when we talked about all these things we would change to make American democracy better, if we had like a really well functioning, very democratic system, well, that's probably a system that it doesn't necessarily like highlight radicalism in those types of processes, right? And we might have a bit more of civic engagement. And so I think that in that regard, if we find ourselves electing people who take the stance that we need to appoint people to this wage board because wages have been depressed for so long, that might just legitimately be a reflection of the fact that we've had, very moderate tendencies in this wage board that have depressed wages. Like, SDL, you can talk about this, but SDL, you did a lot of research on the idea that unions in America were part of that neoliberal wave where unions themselves became a lot more moderate and less willing to strike and less willing to actually take, harsh stances in negotiations, which kind of depleted the union's ability to, really do their job, right? And so, similarly, I don't know if it's necessarily the worst thing if somebody were to campaign on, like, basically, hey, I'm going to appoint people to wage boards that are, like, actually going to take a harder stance, right?
Well, I mean, it seems that when you're promising workers within a certain industry a wage increase, that is just not the kind of thing that you should be able to promise, because that promise is going to be popular whether it's a good idea or not. That's simply the case.
Not
and I'm
right?
very What?
I don't know if necessarily that's true though, right? Because I think the reason I would push back on this is because I've heard for a long time that, like, how do I put this? That, like, I've heard a lot of conservatives say, like, oh, unions are bad because they'll make your company go bankrupt, right? They're just going to ask for way too high of a wage increase and your company is going to go bankrupt. But I feel like, not that you're saying the same thing, but I just don't think in a truly robustly democratic context, we're going to have a problem with, like, wage inflation that's, like, so bad,
So I don't know what context you're talking about. I mean, if we assume that from last episode we have the perfect, wonk-brained democratic institutions, yeah, probably, like, everything's going to be way better. I'm just thinking about, like, real governments like Australia or maybe America, where, like, the government's, like, much worse. Like, I know that's the kind of thing they promise. They do in fact make promises about raising wages, even when they don't have as strong of wage board mechanisms. I don't doubt that they will do that even more frequently. In California, they have a wage board for fast food workers. I think they set their minimum wage there for fast food workers at a level of $20, but there was an exclusion for what was it? Restaurants that don't sell bread. or
I don't know.
something like that.
Well, I mean, even in Australia, like have we seen, because Australia has, I think, typically low, like in the modern period, like typically lower unemployment than America, right? So I would have to see this
I guess
happen. You know what I mean?
I feel
Yeah.
like the simple check for this is minimum wage laws. So, if someone comes in and promises to raise minimum wage laws, it should presumably have a similar political effect, not in one industry. Like you're sort of saying, hey, if this guy comes in, they can promise to raise wages for this industry. Maybe all the workers in that industry will vote for them. Well, minimum wage laws have a similar effect for people of a certain, income band, right? If you're below this income, it'll directly affect you. And if you're in this income, it'll boost you up. But we don't see like Democrats promise $15 minimum wage and suddenly the entire white working class turns back to the Democrats. It just,
Sure.
I'm just not sure.
Well, I mean, surely it's people promise minimum wages, even ones that are, too high,
Sure.
probably for their context, because it gives you political benefits. Now, people promise teacher pay hikes, because that's popular, right? And so there's not very much of a concern about, okay, what is the optimal wage rate for this group? That's not really, your political incentive is not to pursue the optimal wage rate. It is to pursue, the one that allows you to piece together the proper political
the
coalition
socially optimal wage rate.
for you to win. And one other thing I would just note very quickly is that I would definitely oppose wage boards if it was just in certain industries but not others, because then you can get real labor allocation distortions, where wages in one sector are hiked a lot, and then wages in other sectors are kept at a normal market rate. But the conclusion of what I'm saying is, I think there's a lot of tools that we have to improve the labor force, fix market failures in the labor market, and improve the wages and conditions of workers. I think that unions, under certain institutional contexts, can be fruitful to that end. I am skeptical, though, that in America, practically, that the pursuit of higher degrees of unionization, trying to foster, 90% unionization of the kind of institutions which exist and have been developed in Scandinavia over the course of a century, is a realistic, or maybe even a realistically fruitful approach to that end.
I know that this is getting beyond like policy design and getting into politics. I know one of the bitter pills to swallow for like anti-union neolibs who like stuff like UBI and whatnot is that if you want a coalition that's going to get UBI, you're going to have to work with groups like unions. Like there's just no path to like a powerful Democratic Party, like, winning enough seats at the federal level to pass UBI without like some rebuilding of the union movement.
I'm just very skeptical. I mean, I'm very skeptical of that, because we've seen plenty of high-profile unions condemn universal basic income. Like, there's been big condemnations of UBI by them. I don't see where in the political calculus it necessarily only becomes popular to give people money whenever there's a lot of people are paying a percentage of their income to some sort of centralized labor bargaining entity.
I think especially I would say that it seems like the character of like the newly originated unions seems to be different than like the character of the sort of like well-established 5% of private employees that are unionized as well, because it seems like if you look at the actions of like the new like Amazon unionized warehouses, or the Starbucks unions, or even Sean Fain, the DFW, or not the
UAW,
the UAW, that it seems like they are generally a bit more open to essentially being like open progressives, right? That like, hey, we support universal healthcare. Like for instance, a lot of this was controversial in 2016, where some unions had committee endorsements of candidates, but then some unions had membership elected endorsements. And it seemed like the membership elected endorsements would like overwhelmingly vote to endorse Bernie, who would propose things like universal healthcare and like a more universal welfare state. But then like the sort of committee union leadership would endorse Hillary Clinton, right? But that seems to have shifted even more. So I recognize that as a concern. Like certainly there can be a disconnect between like union leadership and what is like actually good sort of progressive policy. But it seems like that's changing. Estiel, you had something to add?
Well, I just did want to suggest sort of what you were talking about, that I think there's a difference in attitudes of newer, more progressive leadership of unions. And I think that a lot of the worst aspects of unions were more common in... So what I was talking with Mike, with Conaboy before the show about was that during the Reagan era, a lot of unions got, I don't know, like traumatized almost by the rapid rate of deunionization and the rapid acceleration of anti-union laws. And so very few unions spent money trying to unionize new workers, which meant that they were very focused on trying to keep the workers they had. So they were very rigidity focused, very security focused. And two, they spent very little money trying to go on strike because they felt they wouldn't have the power and they would just be crushed. And so they didn't actually spend a lot of time bargaining for workers except to like keep the benefits they have. So it was a very like, may sound like a weird analogy, but it was like the NIMBY era of unions, whereas now the expansionist era of unions seems to have come back into vogue. Like Sean Fain is talking about trying to unionize Tesla. He is actively campaigning for wages to rise in other firms. So when you talk about some of the bad effects of unions, right, it's that it raises wages in one firm, but not in other ones. Well, these new unions are really pissed about that, and they're trying to change that. They're trying to like expand their unionization. They're not trying to keep rigidly their workers. I don't know. I do think there's Micah's cutting out, so he's not getting any of my wisdom, but
I can hear everything you're saying.
Okay, perfect.
No, I mean,
I just do think the attitude matters is all.
I think that's fair. I've engaged with this argument on Twitter and in debates previously where people would just say, well, Micah, don't you realize that if you ever want to pass any welfare ever, we have to have like tons of unionization. And I don't see evidence that that's the case. There's plenty of countries that have a more substantive, better organized welfare state than we do, and they have very low unionization rates.
Well, but nowadays they do. But part of the point is that a lot of the welfare that was being passed was coming like previously. I do agree with you that there's some countries like South Korea is probably the key example of a rapidly expanding welfare state with very low unionization rates. And a lot of that just seems to be rising democratic power, people building up and voting for welfare policies over time. The argument I would give is that union power seems to be an accelerant or multiplier or additive to that. There's a study that I like to cite, which shows that like unionization rates in a given town affect the income mobility and the wages of non-union workers and non-union children in like the same municipality. And the suggestion is, well, clearly that they're mostly not like just doing that through raising wages at the one firm. They're doing it through raising wages at other firms by pressure or by passing policies like pro-child policies. So I think empirically there's fairly strong evidence linking like union power to left policies. Now, I'm not saying you can't assemble a coalition without it. I'm just saying that it's easier, right? Like if you want UBI 2035 instead of 2040 or 2050,
Yeah, if the claim is that if you have more unions, it will be easier to do progressive things, that's just true. I would just reject that as like such an important like a prerequisite factor. Like you just can't do anything without it. It's like such a huge. I don't think it's certainly a variable. That's
I mean, totally I think all of our if we had to pick 3 policies to change the American economic system, I don't think any of us would put like get rid of captive audience meetings or something. Like we would say healthcare is number 1. Housing policy, something like that's probably 1 or 2 is housing or healthcare, and then number 3 might be a bit wild. But like like your prioritization doesn't start with like implement wage boards or something.
I mean, I might put for number 3 something like a sectoral bargaining. Some kind of pro-union policy, just because there's a lot of other policies we talk about that are outside the political window right now. And I think the only realm you get to them is one where people as a whole shift left and people as like organized power shift left. And unions are like demonstrably one of the institutions that do that. Like people
urbanization
unions,
as well.
No, urbanization helps. So I want more housing, and unionization helps. Urbanization and unions, funnily enough, they both make people less racist and more pro-welfare. Like, not ironically, it's like a causal impact.
For me, unions would be like, it would be in my top 5. I just don't know if it'd crack my top 3, but it would be up there.
Let me say something positive about unions. I talked previously about kind of how I think a lot of the benefits of unions can be made up using other institutions. And I do really think that's true in terms of like compensation, fixing labor market failures. And I really do also as well think that some like people should not just take monopsony as a blank check, that wages necessarily, because we have this theoretical reason, why they could be too low. Automatically, we could think across the board they're way too low or compensation's way too low. But I will say this, there's one thing that unions do that is very, very difficult to replace. And that is providing people kind of a sense of community and buy-in into their the place they work. And I guess you could replace that maybe with like some sort of separate nonprofit organization, some sort of separate wage board, not wage board, co-determination policy, but that is a real value. And I think that if you want to have a system where maybe low levels of unionization, that's kind of the policy approach you want to take, you still should have some sort of attempt to re-foster that benefit of unions, or at least acknowledge that that's something that you're giving up if you want to have low rates of unionization.
There you go. All right. Well, that seems like a good place to go to the last part of this this discussion here on unions, and this is where we're going to apply it to America specifically. So, I think at our peak, America had maybe like 35% union membership. It really, I mean, there's this idea that we used to be super duper unionized in this country, but that really was never the case. That America had like Nordic levels of union representation. But certainly there was a day when we had substantially higher representation of unions than we have today. And so I guess I probably have the most written here. So let's start with one of you guys. I guess like SDL, if you had to change, like what are some policies that you would want to implement in America? And let's just assume like unified democratic, like 55 senators and 300 members in the House, Democratic president. Like, what were some policies in that context that you'd want to implement that you think would help with achieving our goal of more unionization in a responsible way?
I feel like we have talked about most of these policies, but the long and short for me would probably be some kind of sectoral bargaining through tripartite wage boards, probably an end to right to work laws. I think the PRO Act includes stuff like that. A really expansive NLRB, that's National Labor Relations Board, which sees its mission as trying to ensure that like, it kind of what I mentioned, for example, there's captive employee meetings that like you can just be sat down and be forced to watch a video from your boss, which talks about how unions are evil and will lead to you having lower wages.
Actual North Korea level shit.
Workplaces are autocratic already, and I just don't like the idea. I would not want unions to be able to force people to sit down and watch a video either or something. So I really don't like the idea of captive audiences. So there's a lot of like reforms like that where it would be nice to have the NLRB want to make all unionization into fair elections. I know that this is maybe a sort of wonkish bit, but I'm totally forgetting the name for it. I think it was against the concrete company. Recently, the NLRB changed its rules for when it will fine and when it will recognize a union. And this possibly has really big consequences where if you have a majority of the members, I believe is how it works. If you have a majority of members who sign on to like the let's join a union card, but you haven't held the election yet, and the employer does an unfair labor practice, a ULP, then your union is instantly recognized, is my understanding of the new NLRB rules. So it means that now employers are very strongly disincentivized to try and screw you over in the unionizing process, because if they mess up and if they get found having a ULP, well, then they're screwed. They don't even get to run the election. They like you've already won. So I really like stuff like that, which strongly incentivizes a fair election, in my opinion. Because Econoboy will probably talk about this. There are some people who don't want to join unions, and to whatever degree, you probably don't want to force people in. You don't want to compel them to pay dues to an organization.
Have like Vietnam style, like state enforced unions. Like this is the state union for your factory. They represent you. Don't talk bad about the government, though.
So my TLDR is probably like sectoral bargaining through tripartite wage boards, and right to work type laws. So unions will get a little bit more money. Elect Sean Fain as the leader of every single union, some sort of cloning process, and like the aggressive NLRB policies. But Econoboy has a lot more specific proposals.
For sure. Micah, how would you, what are some, what are the regulations that you would change? What are the institutions you would implement in America, given a sort of realistic proposal, in order to achieve your goals of unionization?
So I would say that I definitely agree with rules that make it where, firms can't union bust in pretty egregious ways, right? Like I think that, there's plenty of unfair practices that they are partaking in, and like that's just not legal, really. It shouldn't be legal. It seems like it's against at least the spirit of our law.
It seems so like I can't get over how dystopian it is
order.
When like I can't get over how dystopian it is when you see these like captive audience meeting videos that employees. It's like, hey, Mr. Employee, did you know that unions are complete dog shit and they steal your money, and the employer is your friend and you should trust us? And
if firms want to like say, hey, here's our negative case against the union, I mean, if the employee wants to listen, that's fair enough, but you shouldn't force them to consume your propaganda. Now, returning to what I said previously, I would just pick the most, I think, realistic policies out of the ones I proposed earlier. I really do think limiting non-compete agreements can do a lot, and I think that's totally possible. States have done that. Like, that's one of the things that California has done well. I do think that a lot of limitations on lobbying are realistic. I do think that the House and Senate could pass a resolution to tell the central bank to use a new target so that we have higher employment rates consistently. I think pay transparency laws, that's happened before. We could do that. And I think these are just like really simple, good ideas. I don't really know if we can actually pass laws that would limit unions' ability to bargain in bad ways. I'm not really sure. Like, I think that somebody would have to show me in the literature that right to work laws are like actually right to work states are actually worse. For me to like start saying that we should ban it at the federal level. All the studies I've seen seem to indicate like it's either neutral or like they're somewhat better. I'm not saying that I actually like the institutional structure of right to work based unionization because it's very strange, right? It's strange to basically allow people to freeload. The open question to me is right to work unionization worse than our very bad union institutions? Is it like even worse? And that's not clear. I would be open to, I think, efforts to maybe we could make some sort of pilot program or like some sort of maybe fund research on ways that we could establish wage boards in ways that would be productive. I am interested in that. Although, as I said, I would not be 100% confident that's a good idea. So I'm gonna stick to my previous list. Also, expand welfare. I think expanding unemployment insurance is a pretty good idea. I imagine it's relatively popular. We need to modernize the unemployment insurance system, make it where people can start getting the money they're entitled to immediately, and make it where they're provided a higher percentage of their wages back, so that people really have the ability to look for the right job for themselves, and to take some of the political pressure off of our politicians to put in place regulations that reduce growth in the long run in favor of more job security in the short run.
Yeah, for sure. I guess some things that I would talk about, of course, I agree with pretty much everything that you guys said. Some things that I would add on. So I tried to do a pretty decently broad review of the literature and writings on unions and union structures and things like this, and come up with a decent list of things that I would change that I think would be realistic to implement. So number one, I would say that yes, like establish sectoral bargaining. I think the way that I would establish it is I would probably create like relatively similar regions in the US. So like one thing that I believe the Spanish system was criticized for is that because their contracts are like so horizontally applied across regions, that creates rigidity as well, because some like take the US for example, like an electrician in California is not necessarily the same in terms of their needs and desires as an electrician that lives in like Alabama, for instance. These are just very different places. And so I would say having regionalization of your sectoral bargaining system probably makes some sense. I suggest maybe there would be like West Coast, like California up to Washington, the Midwest, the Rust Belt, the Southwest, Texas, the South as a region, New York, and then the Northeast. Just trying to think like generally, how can we regionalize these sectoral bargaining contracts to where they're fitted? And all this would functionally mean is that the contract that the sector negotiates is just a contract for that region. So in theory, you could have like an overarching union that represents companies within multiple regions. It's just that the contract itself would be for one region. Like one region's contract could be the same as another region, but you would just have to make that active choice, and you'd have to have that negotiating process. I'm just a little bit skeptical of like for instance, we don't have a country that is so big as the United States that has like a uniform unionization system that works very well. Like the EU has a lot of unionization, but it's decentralized. It's country level sort of regionalized, systems of unionization. And it seems like for all the negatives and positives that regional approach has, it seems like it certainly has negatives and it certainly limits the downsides. Like imagine if we had a Spanish-style unionization policy for the whole of the EU. Well, we would probably just sort of necessarily have worse labor market outcomes, right? And so we probably wouldn't want that. We can recognize that unions in general are good, but also that different regions probably have different sort of fitted needs. And so compartmentalizing your contracts by region probably makes some sense. So you'd have like, I don't know, like the car manufacturer's contract in the Southwest versus the car manufacturer's contract in like the Northeast, right? Like these are going to be different things. And I feel like that's not totally unreasonable. That just reflects what I've read in the literature. These would include, like in these sectoral contracts, the sectoral negotiating process, they would include employers associations. They would also include probably some like state appointed people. So, you know, we'd have these different regions and then the federal government would nominate people to sit on these boards. You know, the president would nominate and maybe the Senate would confirm people to sit on each of these boards. Not frankly dissimilar how we do like the circuit system and judge in the appellate courts. Like I think that's pretty reasonable as well. Overall. One of the reasons why you have sectoral coverage without union density is a lot of these countries have something called extension laws, right? So basically, how do you determine whether or not to extend a union negotiated contract to a non-union worker? Well, you have some sort of extension law. So I would argue that there needs to be a representativeness criteria, which is what most countries have, where it's basically like, hey, you have to have some combination of characteristics that allow you to say that you should be covered by a union contract, even though you're not a unionized firm. So, for instance, one of the requirements could be like, hey, if you get, 35% of the vote in a union, election, well, you're not unionized yourself, but maybe that's enough of a percentage to be covered by the collective contract that's negotiated for your regional sector, right? That could be a reasonable rule. Perhaps if an employer's association covers a sufficiently high percentage of employment. So, for instance, let's say that the companies that exist in your employer's association within your sector represent, 50% of employees. Well, at that point, maybe it's a lot easier to extend those contracts out to the rest of the sector because basically you're already representing almost the whole sector or a majority of the sector. The idea is just that you're trying to ensure that the contract you're negotiating is a good enough sample to be extended across the entire sector, despite unions not actually being present in all of these, firms, right? That's probably good. Another thing is just filtering these extensions through government agencies. Like in Spain, it's just automatic. It's just like, oh, automatic. There it is. No discretion. But just having some sort of like the NLRB is empowered to review extension requests. Like that's probably a good thing. And it allows some flexibility in the system. Micah alluded to it. He didn't call it this, but he alluded to what I would call like a Ghent system. This is another policy that I would say would probably be good. Now, the way that the Ghent system works, there's a lot of debate in terms of like how effective this is at actually maintaining or originating unions. But what it is functionally is that some countries allow unemployment benefits to be administered by unions. So instead of getting, instead of going to like a local unemployment office run by the government and like applying for benefits, getting your check or whatever, you would actually work through that through your union. The caveat is that it's not as efficient as just a centralized unemployment system. So I think that a simpler way to do it, frankly, is just to have boosted unemployment for workers on strike. I think that's basically what the Ghent system is trying to accomplish anyway. And we don't want to have like, an inefficiently administered unemployment system just to try and help unions. So I think the idea is like, hey, if our rule says that you get 80% of your wages for 3 months, let's say that if you're a worker on strike, maybe you get 90% of your wages for 6 months. Just like some sort of boosted unemployment for workers who are specifically on strike might make some sense. Micah, you want to cut in?
I agree with Matt Brunegg. I do not support the Ghent model. He actually wrote an article about opposing the Ghent model.
Yeah, STL and I were talking about that system, like that article as well. And he makes the same argument, basically, that it's just a less efficiently run employment system. And so my argument would be, like, don't make the unions administer the benefits. Like, just have it to where there's some sort of boosted assistance for employees specifically while they're on strike. Again, because I want employees to be able to strike without fear of basically being financially destitute. And so, yeah, Estelle, you wanted to butt in as well.
Just a small point in favor of Micah's type system. If Micah likes the idea of like right to work unions, one way of making it so that union dues aren't as essential for running a successful union is to decrease the importance of dues for striking. So if you do something like Econoboy is saying, and you say pay people like, I don't know, 90% of their wage while they're striking or something, then that enormously decreases the disincentive to strike. So that might make unions less essential. I don't like right to work, but I'm just, if you want to decrease the impact of right to work, you'd want to support stuff like that.
Well, what do y'all think about right to work and right to bargain? So yeah, you can opt out of dues, but the union can opt out of covering you with their contract. That's a thing that's happened.
I really dislike that because a lot of the benefit of stuff there's an efficiency of having a single contract, right? There's a paperwork and a load to having multiple types of workers within one firm, some covered, some not. Like, I don't know. I'm interested in the idea of employment services providers, basically firms that provide workers opportunities for career advancement, like will notify workers whenever their level of skills or like some sort of variables that they've demonstrated showcase that this is the level of compensation they should expect. And so it actually might be good to go bargain, like they could actually even represent you and bargain on your behalf, like optimize firms that seek to optimize workers' compensation and treatment within an individual bargaining context. I think it's just impossible for external firms to get enough information to meaningfully understand the position of a worker in a given firm, especially for small firms. Like maybe stuff like that can work where you have a large firm and like data sharing agreements and wage transparency. And like, I don't know, you might need like performance review transparency or something. But I think that de facto for like 90% of workers, the only way you're going to get an institution that has like enough knowledge of how the internals of a company work to know that is going to be some kind of union.
Yeah. And I would say like, one extra thing that I'm calling the American Gen system is not just like essentially regulatorily a boosted unemployment system. Like I do like the idea of having some sort of like solidaristic type policy, right? So for instance, something that I suggest here is perhaps a portion of dues collected by all unions go into a collective endowment for all unions, right? So you have this portion of dues that goes, it's almost like a tax that unions pay themselves that goes into this collective pool that can help
union
support
tax.
Well, not necessarily a tax, but like, well, it's like a portion of dues. But
Ugovian tax on unions. You heard it here first from
like
Econoboy.
Like for instance, like this fund could be in charge of like supporting the financial cost of like originating new unions, right? And like you have this system where you empower horizontally the labor market's ability to unionize whilst using the labor power that already exists in the firm. And this is combined with a later policy that I'll talk about where like a lot of countries subsidize union dues. Like, hey, if you pay union dues, you can deduct that on your taxes. I would argue that something like that makes a lot of sense because, I mean, yeah, like I don't want workers to feel like they're, like that's one of the main arguments basically against unions, which is a really dumb argument to be fair, but like, hey, if at the very least, if we can get rid of that argument, like people, like Amazon will say, what was it? There's that funny graphic that Amazon was like, man, goddamn, $50 a month? Shit, that could buy you an Xbox. Do you really want this union? Like there was like a graphic like this and it's like, yeah, dumbass. Like obviously I'd probably rather have a union than a fucking Xbox 360 or some shit. But like, you know, that's probably how it should work that, hey, you know, that's just a lie. It's a lie because union dues are tax deductible. Every dollar you pay in a union due, you pay that dollar less in taxes. Like you get the money back as a credit at the end of the year. I think that, you know, eliminating that argument would be good because you can just say, yeah, any argument that says, oh, you're losing out because you're paying union dues is just necessarily wrong because you do get that money back at the end of the year. I think that would probably be a very good policy. And it doesn't cost the government very much money. Like, it's not like union dues are that, it's like a few $100s a year per worker. Like, it's not very much. Yeah, SDL.
The only critique I could see of that system would be if you think unions are genuinely socially useful, then that type of system, like let's assume it's done at, say, a regional level, would tend to have places with less unions pay less dues in and have less ability to form new unions. And if you have concerns about stuff like we talked about the coverage gap earlier, that like you've only got unions in a few areas and they're trying to make a contract for the whole area, you would probably just want to subsidize union creation in general, but you'd want to subsidize in areas that are like underrepresented in those contracts. Like you genuinely want to be like, okay, we're going to have our census sample of unions to make sure that all these different types of firms all get represented in the fast food contract or whatever. So
yeah, well, that's another reason. Like,
why
I
is
think
Micah smiling at that?
I think the subsidization of union dues is not like it's just one of those marginal things, right? Like, I don't think that's gonna make or break
I
union
think
origination.
it's just such a bad idea, honestly. I'm not gonna...
Subsidizing union dues, how could it possibly be that bad? Like, it couldn't possibly.
I like it. I just think you can do better. That's all.
I just think that within the American context, it just doesn't seem clear that the weight of the evidence is that, you know, these unions are having a net positive impact. It seems to me that from everything that I've read, that the weight of the evidence is against that. And I mean, my point has always been not that unions are necessarily bad, is that within our institution context, they're at least not very clearly good.
Well, again, I'm talking about as a full package. I don't like.
Well, yeah, I suppose if you change everything else, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine what we could expect, because we're talking about political reforms like that we can make within our
like one specific
institutions.
thing. One specific thing that I was going to call out, like, and this was literally the next thing that I was going to talk about, was empowering the NLRB. And like the specific proposal that people can look up is the PRO Act, which has been proposed. Like the PRO Act is generally speaking, pretty much just a way to empower the NLRB, right? So what the PRO Act does is it allows the NLRB to impose fines. So right now, the NLRB basically says like, "Hey, you broke the law. I don't do that again." Right? It's not clear necessarily like the strict enforcement mechanism of the NLRB, outside of basically just establishing that rules have been broken and maybe reordering elections and things like this. So allowing the NLRB to propose to basically fine employers and say, "Hey, for every violation, you get a fine of like $50,000." Because what you'll find, it was, goodness, I can't remember it. It was like some crazy high percentage of attempts at unionization have significantly large amounts of employers just breaking the law and not giving a fuck that they're breaking the law, because the NLRB is like a very neutered institution. And so empowering labor institutions to actually enforce, you know, good democratic norms when it comes to originating unions are probably a good idea. So allowing the NLRB to fine employers for breaking the law, I say hire an army of observers, administrators, lawyers, etc. The NLRB should be a very well-staffed agency, right? You know, when you look at the administrative wait times for hearing back from the NLRB, it's very long. And whether you're very anti-union or very pro-union, I don't see why you should be pro like long wait times to hear back from your regulatory agency. Like that doesn't really make sense. So, yeah, like just empower the NLRB to work quicker and more, more efficiently, right? It's similar to like you fund the IRS just because it's good to have like a well-functioning, administrative state. And then a lot of this last stuff, it's covered in the PRO Act as well, but I call it a grab bag of origination changes. So I say subsidize union dues just to get rid of that argument. You can match funds from the government as well. Like, hey, for however much, unions collect in dues, you could match that amount and just like directly inject it into union treasuries. Again, this isn't a very large amount of money, but again, it just, there's a lot more money behind capital than there's ever going to be behind labor. So having some sort of like, I think this would be a pro-social outcome, basically, if we did something like this. You could argue for like bonus payments for workers who establish a union, just provide like a positive incentive, like, hey, we kind of want you to unionize, right? So just really consider that, because at least in the literature that I've read, high union density itself, like the problems that you get with unemployment and these problems is when you have low union density but high coverage. But high union density itself isn't associated with nearly as many problems. So if you can increase the amount of just aggregate workers that are part of unions, you can avoid a lot of the problems associated with sectoral bargaining as well. So having some sort of positive incentive in that regard. SCL talked about it before, but just, protecting secondary, solidaristic strikes. I mean, that probably makes a lot of sense to me. It just seems quite anti-constitutional, frankly, to have a ban on secondary strikes. Like, why am I not allowed to strike for whatever reason I want? Right? It's kind of a weird thing. And obviously banning captive audience meetings. That's just corporate propaganda. Super cringe. Yeah, go on, STL.
I was just, as a historical note, the act in 1947 was like a compromise between the radical labor union and the center sort of Truman part of the Democratic Party. And like just it very much represents both a huge win for unions in a whole bunch of areas, because there was way more union busting before the act. At the same time, it did stuff like crack down on solidarity strikes, which you can argue is like a First Amendment violation, but I don't know.
I think that the idea is it's probably like legal in the same way that antitrust laws are, legal, right? It's like you can't have kind of like monopolistic coordination like this, I imagine.
I mean, that could be the rationale.
You can regulate it.
Yeah, I mean, until we have huge coverage, I just it doesn't seem to be a big.
Something
I know.
I think,
just for what it's worth, I know the logic behind the solidarity strike ban is similar to what you talked about in wanting to try to encourage higher trust. In my understanding, is that the intent of that part of the law from like the business side of the Democratic Party was that instead of having workers striking for other places, you just sort of focus on your workplace and get the best get the best working conditions in your workplace. So trust your management, work with your management, screw those guys over there. That was sort of the idea.
Wouldn't want to be too collective in your bargaining, now would you, Mr. Union employee?
I mean, I think something that's worth acknowledging though is, it's not like strikes are like an actually good thing, right? It's a means to an end. It's bad for the economy. It's like it just leads to less production. It leads to lower incomes for the people that are striking. The best union systems in the world famously have very little strikes.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you want to order your institutions in such a way so as to reduce the likeliness of strikes. Now, I'm not sure whether actually just directly prohibiting.
Sorry, can I give a funny note? Is that it's banned to strike in China, for example. So some of the more allegedly pro-labor countries in the world, like the Soviet Union and China, actually banned that right because they wanted to have a very high productivity economy, and they argued that it was because we need to organize the workers to fight the capitalists or whatever. So we can't be busy with this striking nonsense. So
real socialism. Ban strikes.
Real socialism is when you ban strikes and have
once
one
again
union.
STL hating on actually existing socialism. Name a more iconic duo.
But I think the ideal situation is kind of fostering the relationship between labor and capital. Like that's what they've done in Scandinavia, where it's very productive. There's a lot of awareness, and I think since unionization rates are so high and union institutions have been around for so long, they're able to take a much higher level view of the economy and say, okay, what level of wages can we really bargain that's realistic? What technologies are we going to need to accommodate? And both of them can kind of come together and say, okay, this is the level that's realistic. So there's not strikes.
Yeah, and
I just think it's important to note that we really do want to avoid strikes all the time. If you have a union system that's constantly producing like economy shutting down, shut down level strikes, that's not a union system that's delivering the goods effectively.
Well, I think that's something to be fair though. Like I think when you look into the history of the original, like the sort of proto labor movements that ended up becoming the very strong labor power in a lot of these countries. That was a pretty volatile situation, right? Like you tended to have a lot of violence, you tended to have a lot of oppression, you tended to have a lot of strikes. And so I'm open to the idea that a lot of these, like for instance, secondary strikes, boosted unemployment for striking workers, union dues subsidization, one-time payments for like these things, like one-time payments for workers that form a union. I'm open to rolling back a lot of that stuff at the point where we have decent union coverage and like good sort of bargaining, like collective contract coverage as well. But I will say that it certainly seems like there needs to be like a positive push. The last thing that I have in my list here is, like one of the arguments from Capital is it lowers our returns. And, insofar as we're probably not going to repeal the corporate tax, maybe just having a tax advantage for companies that have unions, right? It's like, hey, maybe capitalist guy, like, maybe having this union does hurt your fucking, your company, right? But, maybe you're taxed at some marginally lower rate if you have union coverage in your company, right? Just avoid that argument in general. And plus, any excuse to lower corporate taxes, right? Because I think we all recognize that that's not the greatest form of taxation anyway. So if we can lower corporate taxes in a way that encourages unionization, I think, probably that's good. STL, what do you want to say?
Oh, I would probably prefer the solidarity, like the the sectoral bargaining approach, just because it has a simpler tax system. Like I don't know, in general, we don't seem to like tax write-offs for specific stuff. So I don't know.
Stop random tax expenditures and subsidies.
Look,
revealing himself as a hypocrite.
The thing is, though, I'm in favor. I'm in favor of tax expenditures for a lot of, like, because the corporate tax, we might as well use the corporate tax as a tool when we can, if we're not going to just get rid of it, right? And so that's kind of the argument that I'm making here.
I think you just make the corporate tax based and make it a DBCFT. I don't know about y'all.
Well, right, but we're talking about, you criticize us for not being, we're talking about realistic solutions.
Honestly, I think it's more realistic that you make that you change the basis of the corporate tax and change deductibility for like certain things like R&D and CapEx. We've already reduced the deduct. What?
Strongly disagree. I can't imagine.
Wait. So you think we made R&D fully expensible? We made CapEx partially expensible. So you think going all the way is somehow harder?
Well, both of those things are temporary, and they don't include all CapEx or all R&D. And number two, I think
that's what I said.
Well, no, because you didn't say they're temporary. You said, well, we made these things fully expensive. Well, they're temporary, right? So I think that I agree that the wonky tax policy is definitely becoming more in vogue, but I don't think there's a realistic world where we get rid of the corporate tax. Like, that would be pretty.
I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is,
or replace it with a DBCFT, right? That's, that seems like what you're saying.
So I don't think that you need to do a destination basis, but if you change the deductibility and you make it permanent, which totally seems like there's a political coalition to do that, and then you use there's various different bases you can use. I think it's like a territorial tax system is something that would be much less disruptive than a destination basis. Then at that point, the corporate tax is like not even close to one of your worst taxes. Like, it's like a pretty solid tax. And I'd say that's certainly as realistic as what you're talking about. I'd argue much more realistic, but
well, it's about the coalition that you get together to do it, right? Like, because the Republicans aren't going to do any of this union shit. 0% chance, like actually 0% chance. If you have a sufficiently high number of Democrats in office, that's the environment that I'm imagining. So if you have an environment where you've got a democratically dominated government, I think you could pass you could pass everything that I just listed in a democratically dominated, caucus,
you could pass everything I just listed in for the tax changes in both. You need them.
I don't know if you could, though, because it seems like it seems like a lot of the tax reforms, when it comes to expensing, it's like either bipartisan deals or it's like Republican governments that propose that kind of thing, right?
Bipartisan, interesting.
Well, yeah, but again, if you have a deal such that you're losing, if you have a sufficiently what could be branded as like a right-wing tax bill, I would worry that in the House you end up with 50 progressives voting against it, and now it doesn't get passed, right? Now, you could be right. We're kind of just, game theorying this out. But anyway, that's all to say that I think some sort of tax advantage or subsidization for companies that have, basically, union membership in their structure is reasonable. I mean, to be fair, Joe Biden did something like this when he part of the scoring criteria for government contracts is, are you a unionized company? So you're marginally more likely to get federal contract dollars if your employees are covered by a union. And it's not like this is a incredible deal breaker or originator of a huge unionization movement. It's just that marginal sort of effect that it can have, and I think this would be similar as well. And again, that's how you minimize the potentially negative effects as well by not having some crazy pro-union policy. Essa, you were trying to get in earlier. What were you going to say?
All I was going to say is I think kind of what you suggested, that you'd like to subsidize unions, but at some point cut it off when we get to some level of, we were talking about the coverage gap. So let's say you get, 50% union density, but you've got 100% coverage. Maybe a 2 times gap isn't too bad. One of the arguments I wanted to extend was something that Micah talked about earlier, that unions and democratic firms in general can be a form of community. When we talk about the rise in loneliness in this country, I know this is a weird argument for unions, but people need more spaces where they know people, they work with people, and they trust those people. So I think there's a real benefit to having extensive unionization. Even if it has some very minor, slight economic bads, it might have a huge social positive at the macro level by making people less likely to off themselves and go on like extremist shootings or whatever. Like very bluntly,
a little bit
So
more
I know I
engaged.
pushed back against a lot of the arguments for unions. I honestly think this is one of the better ones. I think it's pretty, because I've when I was running a campaign, I've dealt with a lot of the local unions, like the plumbers union, and you really do see it's like, wow, this is like a place where people can like socialize. If their employer does something bad to them, they can rely on this entity. And many times, if you have a union that's actually separated from the firm, the union can actually help you. They can provide training to you. They can help you get your permits, your licenses. They can help you find job opportunities. That's the kind of stuff that I think unions uniquely provide, and that good institutions would enhance that stuff while trying to minimize the bad.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I think having collective pots of money that all unions can draw from and pay into, just again, having that sort of horizontal labor power, even cross region, could make a lot of sense. Some of the things that I was going to mention as well, I keep talking about this, like, for instance, I'll go ahead and pull it up here. We were just talking about it in the pre-show chat. Here we go. So the OECD, they have this pretty useful website when it comes to comparing the different collective bargaining structures amongst countries, right? So just got collective bargaining, and you can kind of click on, all the different countries and, compare and contrast them. And like I said, one of the big pieces of research that I was trying to determine is like, well, why is, this coverage gap, it's pretty similar between the Netherlands and Spain, but the Netherlands has super duper low unemployment and Spain has super duper high unemployment. Like what are the differences here? Insofar as we think this coverage gap causes some unemployment, why is it so much different in Spain? And there's a lot of reasons, not just the reasons that I'm about to mention. But when we look into this, this is the report that the OECD authored for the Netherlands. And you can see that this is the report that they authored for Spain. And you can see that they both have sectoral bargaining. They both have what they would classify as organized, decentralized bargaining. And they both have very similar rates, right? About 10 to 20% union density, about, 70, 80%, 90% coverage. But, what sticks out is that this right here, this quality of labor relations and the level of coordination, it's high in the Netherlands and it's low in Spain. Now, what does this mean, right? What it means is that labor relations are dog shit in Spain. The unions and the capital interests have very little trust between each other. They don't necessarily have a great working relationship. And because of that, you don't necessarily get, as good at contracts, right? And you can actually compare the strike rates. I guess this is number of work days lost per 1,000 salary employees from 85 to 2015. And then you can compare that with the Netherlands. You can see the strike rate in the Netherlands is substantially lower than the strike rate in Spain, going to Micah's point that, like, you don't necessarily want strikes all the time. You want, like, the credible threat of a strike, but you don't actually want to have strikes, like, all the fucking time, right? And so one of the policies that I have on my list here that attempts to ideally address this is where I think, again, employee stock ownership, union stock ownership, these are things that are good, that can help collapse the incentives of labor and capital into one. And then also, this is where worker board membership can be a part of fostering a trusting relationship between labor and capital. If you have employees that are in the boardroom and having these meetings in the capital table and having that collaboration between like unions and the workers that are on these boards, I think that you can foster a more trusting relationship and ideally not have as many problems with like a super duper crazily adversarial relationship between unions and capital. To Micah's point, I think a lot of leftists will say that like the point of unions is to be adversarial. The point of unions is to strike and to destroy the economy if they need to in order to get what they want. And what you find is that that's just really not a good working relationship, and that it doesn't, it turns out, flipping the table and acting like Donald Trump during a negotiation is like actually not the best way to get good deals done, So that's something to keep in mind. STL, what were you going to say?
Oh, I totally forgot. I have no idea.
Damn it, STL. God. Anyway, but no, those are all the changes that I would make. I mean, it sounds like there's a a lot of overlap. It sounds like SDL and I are a little bit more like on the board of subsidizing various aspects of unions than unionization. Mike is a little bit more skeptical of that, but overall, it sounds like we agree that captive audience meetings and corporate propaganda is a big problem. The NLRB should be funded like 10 times more than it's funded now. It sounds like we agree that sectoral bargaining is like probably the best system, but you got to be real careful how you structure it. And those are some, broad agreements that we have. And all three of us agree that unions are good and like provide value. We agree that unions are a good social institution for people as well. A little bit less incels in the world with a world with more unions, right? That's probably a good thing.
That's true.
Any final thoughts on unions before we...
Boy's number one reason to support unions is that it makes teens fuck. So true, King.
True. Got me. Yeah. We're all groomers if we support unions, I guess. Typical leftists. But
you want people socializing? That's where people get groomed. Nice try, buddy.
Well, anyway, any final thoughts on unions before we hang this topic up?
One final thing I'd say is I've seen this argument. I just want to hear y'all's thoughts on it. One of the reasons that people have listed for the decline in the relevance of unions across the world over time is that increasingly we have less standardized labor, right? So if you're unionizing factory floor workers, that might be easier than maybe unionizing tech workers, which are kind of doing more individualized labor, where like contracts that are it's not nearly.
There we go. Well, we get the question though. I guess
no. Just to speak to it a little bit. One of the most interesting trends in employment research, to speak to what Mike is talking about, is that routine jobs have been automated. So there's this scale of routinization based on how we grade certain jobs, and so a lot of manufacturing jobs, especially those in like the 1900s, were very routinizable. It was like you are the guy who does this one bolt, and you crank this one shaft, and then that's it, and that's your one job. It's very easy to build a robot to do that compared to like engineer or something. Like AI is just the cusp of like maybe being able to do some of those tasks. So I do think that's a part of it. But I think the main reason for it is that the most of the easily routinizable tasks were in manufacturing, and the shift to services, in my opinion, seems to be the main reason for the decline in unionization. And that seems to be mostly a mechanical result of jobs with higher turnover, and jobs, and this will sound like a weird one, but there's more large firms with small workspaces, like small individual areas. So if you're a fast food worker, you work in a place that has like 5 employees in the shop at any given time, maybe 20 employees overall, but you're like part of a company that might have like 10,000 employees or 1 million employees, and they've got a shitload of money to spend on anti-union propaganda. And so it sort of tilts the scale a bunch when instead of one factory where you've got 3,000 boys and you can all group up in one big meeting and vote on your union, you've got to organize like 7 people in a McDonald's when they've got a lawyer coming in. And without exaggeration, this literally happened at a Chipotle. There were some Hassan stands. I'm not exaggerating. Some people watched Hassan. They realized that 2 of them watched Hassan together. They decided to form a union, and the company sent in 3 people from National to try and break up their nascent union. So like, unironically, a Chipotle with like 7 employees formed by like a union formed by fucking Hassan stands was getting broken up by Chipotle National. So it's actually a really big problem. Is so like the structure of modern workplaces. That would be my answer.
Yeah, and like something. I think a simple regulation that you could implement is like if you have like establishment level unions should not be a thing. Like if you could be the first to establish a union for your establishment, but if you have subsequent establishments within the same corporate structure unionizing, these need to be a collective contract of some sort, right? That we see these origination problems in like the Starbucks unions where all of these unions are struggling to get a contract because, like SDL said, you've got like a store with like 20 employees that has voted. Hey, 12 of us voted. And now we're gonna unionize all 20 of us in this store, but it's like Starbucks is a billion. Who gives a shit about this one store with 20 employees? Like why do I gotta care about these guys, right? So, but if you basically say that, hey, you have to pool these resources together and negotiate as a single contract for your company, that makes a company level. Like as bad as company level unions can be, establishment level unions are obviously significantly worse, right? So. Some regulation in that regard makes a lot of sense.
And just to back it up, I posted the article. Slate actually wrote about it. Just like and it's funny because Hassan stands Teehee Chipotle, but like this happens all the goddamn time.
Yeah.
So
and to Micah's point about, it kind of goes to what SDL said about the nature of labor changing and how the nature of labor might just simply make it harder to unionize certain companies. Like, I think that the narrative on manufacturing versus service work is a big one, because what you find with service work is that it's a lot higher turnover, right? And if you have a bunch of employees that don't feel like attached to their job, like for me, right? Like, I'm the kind of employee where like I don't have like corporate patriotism. I'm not like, yep, I go to work here and I just love this company, and like, that's just not
You're
me.
not Japanese.
Right. And so the point is that if and a lot of the times if it's a high turnover job, like a high schooler who's working at a fast food place is not going to give a shit if there's a union at the McDonald's or not, right? They're not going to care, because they know that they're going to quit in like 18 months and go to college, and who cares if this place unionizes or not. And when you have fast food places where, legitimately like 10, 15% of your employees are basically high school kids, college kids, well, yeah, it's going to be a lot harder to unionize.
It's probably more.
Well, I'm just saying, like, it probably is, but like, if you got a 6-month turnover rate of like 70%, I mean, yeah, it's going to be really hard to unionize this company. There's not an easy solution to this problem if you want these places to unionize, but wage boards, wage boards could be a way to collectively bargain that aren't necessarily union based, but could be some drawbacks.
Can I add 2 notes to this one?
You can't. SDL. No.
Historically, one of the only unions that ever tried to effectively organize people with really high turnover was the IWW, actually, like the anarchist union back in the 1910s. And they mostly organized like seasonal farm workers. But just to give an idea of how high turnover that meant for the IWW was, I believe it's something like every year they lost 75% of their members and gained 75% new ones. So like, it was really hard for them to do that. And that's part of the reason they collapsed. Like, they were based on this constantly shifting sand of workers who weren't in one place. They were constantly moving. It's just really hard. That and the FBI, like arresting them or whatever. There were multiple reasons they fell apart.
Just a little FBI interference here and there.
Just a little. But the second note that I wanted to add was there's this really neat article back from, I shouldn't say it's that neat. It's just noting that I like its title. It's called Politics Matter, Changes in Unionization Rates in Rich Countries from 1960 to 2010. And what it notes is that there has been a decline in unionization in almost all of the rich countries between like the 1980s and the Great Recession. But that decline basically didn't happen, or happened far less in countries that were ruled by social democrats or had social democratic union systems. And it was far larger in systems which had like United States type labor markets. So I think there's some degree to which like the shift in service causing a decline in unionization was partly a result of the political choices we made when it was happening. And so there's the suggestion that we could choose differently and maybe undo that or reverse that. So that would be in short, if you look at this article, I think the average loss in unionization.
Sean Fain for president, 2028. That's what I'm hearing, SDL.
In the SOCDEM countries, I think unionization density rates, so that means membership rates, which is the harder one, dropped by like 5%. In like market economies like Germany, it was like 20%. And in Anglo countries like America, it was like 30 or 40% or something. So some ridiculous number. So
there you go. Well, there you go.
Sectoral bargaining good?
Sectoral bargaining good. Bunch of nuance in there. And yeah, I think the key takeaway from this discussion is that unions provide utility. Unions provide a value to both society and workers themselves. And so again, it's going to be a matter of what are the experiments for union models that have been done, for policies regarding unions that have been done. What are the experiments happening currently, like the Californian wage boards? Let's just see how it works out. Fuck, maybe it just works in California, and maybe that's a good model for the rest of the country.
Unlikely.
Right?
Works in California. Unlikely.
Well, that is the advantage of the EU and the US federalized system is, we can run these experiments and kind of just see how they work out, right? And so
then not implement anything we ever learned from them.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's useful. If you know a policy doesn't work, that can help. But that's pretty much it on unions, guys. There you go.